Welcome, welcome, welcome to another amazing episode of You Make It Happen. Today we have a guest on. Anna is joining us. She is an expert in BPD, borderline personality disorder. She is certified a DBT instructor, and the conversation is absolutely stimulating. I do want to tell you guys there are trigger warnings here. There are suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and trauma stories involved, so caution. Thank you to everybody for rating the podcast, sharing it with your friends, family, coworkers, anybody really that you know of that you could think would benefit from it or just enjoy listening to it is the biggest compliment you can possibly give. Please don't forget to rate and review, leave a comment. I do read all the comments. Let's get into it, shall we? Okay, thank you so much for being here, Anna, on the You Make It Happen podcast. I'm just so excited to talk to you about this today, and I'm so excited for our listeners to hear more about you and more about what I've been talking about, which is borderline personality disorder and sometimes undiagnosed borderline personality disorder, and like how it affected my life living with somebody with that, not even knowing that they had it. And can you tell our listeners a little bit about your diagnosis of BPD and your other diagnoses, which include depression, anxiety, general anxiety disorder, OCD, CPTSD, panic disorder, anorexia? And for those listening, OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder, CPTSD is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and the rest of them don't include acronyms, so there we go.
Yeah, I can definitely do that. I will say just a little bit of background to my life is I was adopted within my family, and so there was the start of the abandonment issues that I had when I was younger.
Of course.
Growing up, I had a really strained relationship with my mom, who probably has her own undiagnosed issues. Honestly, I think everyone in the world has some sort of form of a mental disorder because...
Yes, thank you.
Even though, like, we may be very sane or very calm or well-collected beings, everybody has their own personal problems.
Yes.
And we all handle them differently. So, and that is where disorders and mental health disorders come into play.
I think people have such a stigma around this too. Like, oh, mental illness. I don't have any mental illness. It's like, or mental disorders. It's like, that's not a bad thing. That's what all adult human beings struggle with or have experienced. Like, everyone has experienced childhood trauma, because I've said in a previous episode, even just emotionally neglecting a child or not emotionally validating a child can create childhood trauma.
Exactly.
So I'm like, even the smallest thing that the best, most secure, well-intended parents, it still happens. Like, I mean, so it just doesn't exist that we don't have some sort of, mental illness, mental disorder, or whatever you want to call it. Like, I think Maddie mentioned in her episode, like, if you are living in today's world and you don't have some variation of depression or anxiety, like, exactly, you've been living under a rock.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and all mental health disorders start with our perception and how we perceive. And that is how they are created. How we perceive, how we react to them.
Can you tell the audience, like, when you were diagnosed with BPD and what that looks like? And again, that's borderline personality disorder.
I was diagnosed with BPD probably about last year after I had a big accident. Before we even got to the BPD diagnosis, I was diagnosed with the other things that you had mentioned, the general anxiety, the OCD, the obsessive compulsive disorder,
right,
complex PTSD, a panic disorder, anorexia, depression.
And I want people to hear how this diagnosis doesn't mean your life ends if you have BPD. Your life doesn't end if you have major depressive disorder. Your life doesn't end if you have OCD. And you can have friends and a full life and a wonderful experience in life, regardless of what mental health diagnoses, I think it is, that you have. And a diagnosis is just a label. It's not...
It's a label to help you define something so that when you share it with other people, they could be like, oh, that's what it is.
Right.
But that's where the challenge is, too, is, like I was saying, these diagnoses have branches.
Right.
Like, you can say, oh, I have anxiety. Well, what kind of anxiety? I have depression. What kind of depression?
Exactly. That's so specific.
Or what forms of depression?
Yes.
because you can have a kind of depression. Like I have major depressive disorder, right? Mm-hmm. But it's what's form? Is it suicidal ideation, or do you actually act on it?
Or is it just lack of energy? Like a lot of major depressive disorder is I have trouble getting out of bed, or doing the dishes seems like a monumental fucking task.
Exactly. And
right, which it was for me.
A lot of people, I think, also when they think about and hear about depression is, oh, it's only suicidal. It's not.
Right.
It's not.
Or you're sad. A lot of people conflate depression with sadness. And it's like, depression doesn't even necessarily intersect with sadness.
It's actually a lack of.
Exactly. It's just a lack of anything. It's just numbness and emptiness and lack of energy. Mm-hmm. Like I remember when I had major depressive disorder, and now I have mild depression, which is treated. But when I had major depressive disorder and I would travel, that was one of the things that brought me up to like baseline normal. Mm-hmm. And I was like, what the fuck is wrong with me that travel, which is so exciting, I'm going to Sweden, I'm going to another country, I'm stopping in Denmark, and I'm just fucking baseline. I'm like, what the fuck is wrong with me? And then, after years of work on myself and self-education and therapy and a lot of reading and psychological delve down rabbit holes, many years later, especially after reading the book What Happened to You, which I recommended, I don't know, one of my episodes. There's a whole bunch of episodes. They all conflate for me in my mind. But that book, I recommended What Happened to You. And the narrative really did change in my mind from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And it changed for me as well, because I'm like, okay, it's not what's wrong with me, it's what happened to me.
It's interesting that you say that, because there is a saying that I do say where if you ever say you should do this, you're essentially saying you're shitting on yourself.
Yep.
Because
I love that saying.
You're setting yourself up for failure saying you should, when it should really be, and here I am going to shit on myself, I'm going to
shit all over the place.
Right. But in reality, it's the same thing if you say, I'm going to try to do that. Well, if you're going to try, you're not putting your full effort, right?
I'm going to do that.
I'm going to do it. You will need to change it from a midpoint maybe action to an action.
Yes.
So.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you for saying that.
So instead of saying should, I could, or I will.
I will, yes.
And I will is the biggest one. And, you hear this talk a lot where when you have these diagnoses and BPD, the biggest therapy that's the most helpful is DBT, Dialectical Behavioral Therapy.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I preach DBT so much.
That therapy, you go through each of those 4 quadrant components that make up that therapy, and each one you explore, you end up noticing that you're telling yourself you should.
Yep. My therapist has said that to me, and I remember the first time she said it to me, because I was like, whoa. It was like one of those aha moments, right? Because she was like, you know what? I'm going to tell you something right now. And she prefaced it with something like, be prepared for this. And I was like, okay, you're shoulding all over the place. And I was like, what? What do you mean? I don't get it. And then she explained it, and I was like, oh, that's bad.
Yeah.
Oh.
It's very bad.
I need to work on this. Okay, you will. I'm gonna work on this. And I haven't eliminated it from my vocabulary. Like
I haven't either. It's really tough.
It is tough. Well, and Pete Walker mentions it in his book, Complex PTSD, which I'm rereading at the moment because I have complex PTSD. And I think a lot of people have complex PTSD. Once you understand what complex PTSD is, it's easy to relate to the fact that I think most adult humans have complex PTSD.
I think the best way to define it for your listeners is PTSD, normal post-traumatic stress disorder, is short-term, where complex PTSD is long-term.
I don't know. After reading that book and now I'm rereading that book, I'm like, I think the whole world should know most people have this.
Yes.
Yes. Most people have complex PTSD. And I think it sounds, because it has PTSD in the title, it sounds scary. And it sounds like, oh God, that's mental illness, I don't have that. Or, oh, that's a diagnosis, I don't have that, that's too scary.
Think about a time when you're out and about, or you're talking to somebody and they say something and you all of a sudden you're just like, ooh.
Yeah. Yep, that's complex PTSD.
That's a PTSD response.
It is.
And whether it doesn't matter how extreme or how, like, it could be really mild. Like, you can say something that's can come across perceived hurtful.
Yes.
But it's not. It's just more of a logical mindset that you're speaking out of. And it's like, this is a fact, right? But I can perceive it as, oh, this is your opinion. And I can be like, you can feel that twinge in your heart, or you're mentally, you're like, ooh, that was kind of hurtful. Or like, ooh, that made me feel weird. And it's because you usually have those responses, and this is where empathy comes into play. If you're empathetic and you've experienced it before.
Right.
That's how you recognize it. And
yes.
that's how you can pick up on it so quickly.
Yes.
Where a lot of times, if you've never experienced hurt like that and you are hearing it for the first time, it is a slow reaction that you're going to have. So you may not recognize it in that moment, but let's say 24 hours from now, after you've slept on it and let your brain process everything, you might wake up feeling a little like, oh, this feels weird. Like, that was kind of like a backhanded slap to the face a little bit.
Yep.
Whether it was intentional or not.
Intent without action is meaningless.
I always live by my core values.
I am so glad you brought that up, because core values, I think, are something that a lot of people are missing, even people doing the work. Mm-hmm. I've encountered, like, and I'll just use dating as an example, because I usually ask people about their core values early on, very early on, if not in the initial conversation, then in the first date. Like, what are your values? They don't even know the term core values necessarily. And I usually stump people, because they're like, what? I don't know what do you mean value? Like, what do I value? Like, I don't know, money sounds good.
Exactly.
Okay, this is not a good fit.
Yeah. I'm the same way. And when I first started therapy, before I was officially diagnosed with BPD, it was like, the first question was, what are your core values?
Yeah.
And I had such a hard time figuring it out. And it's like,
I was like, what? I don't know. I value stuff.
Well, and then you can have superficial core values, or like, I'm talking more like, you can have like, well, this is what I appreciate in other people.
Right.
And so if you appreciate that in other people, do you appreciate that about yourself?
Exactly.
Do you live by those? If you appreciate other people's values, yes. Do you act on those values for yourself? Do you live by them already? So I had to think about it that way and kind of break it down. There's actually an activity that I encourage people to do too. And it's kind of like a little crafty, fun activity.
Oh, okay. Tell me about it.
I have it still. So you come up with 18 values.
Yes.
That you like.
Yes.
And you get popsicle sticks. And you build your house.
I like this.
So
I feel like we should tell Brene Brown about this, because she would enjoy it.
Probably. So you build a little house with these popsicle sticks. And so you have your foundation. What are your top 3 core foundations? Like, what are the foundations that make up you?
Right.
Right?
But, I mean, you've obviously done a lot of healing and trauma therapy and work on yourself. Can you tell us what that journey specifically has looked like?
I think to get into that, I'd have to probably share a little bit of what I went through. I was in a long relationship, almost a 3-year relationship with somebody who there was lots of cheating involved. There were decisions I even made where I'm not proud of myself on. But
We've all been there.
And there was a lot of emotional, mental, and physical violence.
Gotcha.
A lot of abuse. I've disassociated before, like, throughout my life. Mm-hmm. But I've never really gotten to the point where I've disassociated, where I was not in control of my own action. A lot of people kind of get confused when they think about disassociation. I was like, oh, you're staring off, or you really are not present.
Right. Like, people sometimes conflate that with daydreaming. Mm-hmm. And it is not the same thing.
It is not the same. Daydreaming is not an action-based.
Yes.
Disassociation, but that's the thing. You can be disassociated and not be action-based.
Oh, yeah.
What led up to my accident, from that relation being so bad as it was, mm-hmm. and so volatile, I ended up getting into a position towards the end of it where I was pushed to my limit. Keep in mind, when I say it was extreme, there was an extremency to how abusive it was. Mm-hmm. A lot of isolation. Like, I had no one in my corner in my mind.
Yeah. Except for this person.
Except for this person, yeah.
Right, because they're controlling and manipulating.
Exactly.
And narcissist?
Narcissistic.
I'm just guessing.
Yeah, 100% narcissistic.
Oh, gold star for Missy.
And
like, that sounds familiar.
Yeah. And we would talk about, this is like how you know it's narcissistic, right? We would talk about how like, oh, I want to do these things, and there would be that supportiveness, right?
Yes.
But then as soon as you do something about it, all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's a waste of time, or it's not worth it,
or this conflicts with my schedule, so you can't do that.
Or not even that. Like, let's say I would go get a drink with a friend.
Yeah.
Right? Because I wanted more friends in my life. We're social by nature. You can't live in isolation, right?
Yeah,
so
human
I
beings
craved
are social.
that throughout this time period.
No matter how introverted you are, human beings are social creatures.
But then if I'd go do that and then I came back, it was... the energy of the house was just, like, awful. So awful.
Like, that tension and that...
Yeah, the tension.
Yeah.
And then when I get there, it would... instant argument. Like, bad mood, like... He knew where I was, but... And he was totally supportive about it when I initially set it up. And then when I got back, it was... You're such a whore, you're such a slut, like, you're...
The shaming, name-calling,
yeah,
psychological abuse.
Psychological abuse, lots of it. And sometimes the arguments would end up being physical, and there'd be screaming and yelling. So it was rough, and it was a daily occurrence. And when I say isolation, it was isolation.
Yeah.
I rarely saw friends. Rarely even saw my family. The same thing would happen if I even went to go see one of my parents or siblings or whatever, whoever it was. So what led up the accumulation of everything that I had gone through in this relationship over time led up to this moment where I couldn't take it anymore, and I had actually just walked away from the situation physically to kind of calm down. Completely disassociated though. My subconscious taken over because I consciously couldn't handle it anymore.
Yeah.
What led up to the accident was suicidal ideation, but I never would have genuinely planned or act on it necessarily. But because I was disassociated, I did.
Yeah. So you were having suicidal ideation when you were disassociated, or you were having suicidal ideation and then disassociated and made an attempt?
So I had suicidal ideation where in the back of my mind, I'm like, I just want to get out of this. This is an absolute hellhole.
Right.
Right? Like, and
I see
to me, the only
way
is
out.
no other way out, right?
No other way out, yeah. Why does anybody think about suicide? Because they see no other way out.
Exactly. But there is a difference between ideation and attempt versus suicidal and you're planning an attempt, because this wasn't planned.
Okay.
So there's a big difference between the two.
Right. Premeditative, like I am coming up with a plan and I have...
This is how I'm going to do it. Right. Exactly.
Means and medium, all that.
But being dissociated, you don't have control over your actions necessarily. It is like, the sensation is like, the way I describe it is, in this moment, I was outside of my body mentally, watching myself from another point of view and watching my actions and everything around me.
Yes.
And so what actually happened was that ended up happening, and I lined myself up, and I remember this. I was on top of like this rocky cliff. I lined myself up, and my ex was there for a moment, and he was yelling at me like, just do it, like, just kill yourself, it doesn't matter.
Oh my, wow.
And then left me. I hadn't done anything yet. And that's when I lined myself up, and I was like, he's right. I don't know what to do. I can't control the situation.
Yeah.
I don't know how I'm going to fix whatever's going on. I need an escape. I can't do this anymore. And that's when I lined myself up, and I watched myself from outside of my body do it. And I just remember I was like, just let go.
Yeah.
I couldn't take it anymore.
Yeah.
I kept telling myself, just let go, and I closed my eyes and I fell backwards.
Oh, wow.
So I made sure, because it's not that I logically wasn't still there. I was somewhat, because otherwise I wouldn't have lined myself up.
Right.
A rocky cliff, hit the back of your head first. Instant, right?
Right.
But yeah, somehow I survived.
And I'm glad you did.
Yes.
And I think the world is a better place to have you in it.
Thank you. It is. It was over 45 feet.
Because, I mean, let's just talk about the fact that just sharing this is helping other people.
Oh, yeah.
Like, without having you here, without your contribution to the world and you being here, the world is a better place, because I can absolutely promise you, I have enough listeners that have told me, just I have helped them. You are going to help so many people just sharing this publicly, and you have helped so many people doing everything that you've done, and we'll get into that later. But it's amazing, and I'm so grateful that you're here.
It was a massive roller coaster, I will tell you that, though.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I did actually die from the fall. Ended up with a brain bleed, and I had a collapsed lung. Most of my ribs are fractured.
Mm-hmm.
And I had some spinal fractures. Luckily, not dislocated fractures, but it's just normal fractures, so no like nerve damaging in like my legs and stuff.
So lucky.
So no paralyzation. I do have nerve damage in my back, but no paralyzation. My ex was actually the one who came back and brought me back.
Oh, okay.
And put me on an emergency board and took me to the hospital.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Instead of calling the hospital. And I was on an island, so I ended up flying off of the island and was in the hospital for about a whole month.
Yeah.
Due to the experience, though, of that led up to the accident, the hospital put me in the psych ward for those last 2 weeks of my stay there.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And so that's when I got started on the medication. Mm-hmm. So they put you in a different type of isolation when they do that. They take your phone. You're not allowed to have any social media. You rebuild your sense of community there.
Yes.
Because at least the one I was in, that was their focus.
Yes.
You participate in the classes, and if you participate in the classes that they offer while you're there, like the activities really is what they were.
Right.
It is one of the ways to make sure insurance covers it, for one. That sense of community is a reminder you're not alone. There are people who go through things just like you do.
Yes.
And there are these activities that actually help your mind and your body and your soul just kind of like meditate in that activity. But there are also actual self-reflective activities where they'd be like worksheets and things like that.
I love that.
So with my personal experience, I didn't know I had BPD at the time,
of
right?
Course, yeah.
But being with somebody who's a narcissist, they knew how to manipulate to a point where they would give me those endorphins, right? And so that makes you cling on to it. It's like, oh, this makes me feel good in this moment.
Yep.
But then the next moment, you're not going to feel so good because they're going to be different with you, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you know that you're going to get those endorphins again, so you stick around for it. You're addicted to those endorphins.
Yes.
Whether you want to admit that it's a good thing or a bad thing or not, you're subconsciously doing it.
Oh, yeah.
You're sticking around, and mentally and logically you'll be like, I need to get out of this, but you can't.
Well, there's a difference between logically knowing what we would do that benefits us or what is the best thing for us and what feels good or what our brains are used to. And also, I think I've mentioned this in another episode, but I don't think I quite expanded upon it enough, which is change is scary to the brain. Like, we're neurobiologically hardwired to seek what is familiar, even if it's abusive. We are neurobiologically wired to seek what is familiar because that is comfortable. Change is scary.
Exactly.
And the brain is not wired to make you better or grow. It is wired to stay safe.
Exactly. So even throughout my therapy, when I left the hospital, I actually went to a intensive therapy program.
Oh, yeah.
When you get diagnosed with mental health problems and you get psychiatric meds, that's one thing. But when you incorporate your body and your diet and the way you eat into it, a lot of people can manage their mental health disorders based off of diet and physical health.
Yes. Can you just say that again? That's a whole body approach. Oh my God. How revolutionary. Yes,
Yeah.
I preach this. The whole body approach is what's important. Like, it's not just going to therapy. It's going to therapy, yes, like work on your trauma, and it's working on your body, and it's working on your nutrition, and it's being mindful, and it's yoga, and it's paying attention to what feelings you feel in your body and exploring those and letting them out. And it's just so many things, right? And I think people are surprised, and maybe surprised to know that diet, meaning what you eat, not a diet, not diet culture, but what you eat for nutrition, can dramatically influence your mental health.
100%, yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's so many people that don't necessarily either know that or understand that, and people that believe that. And I'm like, sweetheart, try it and you will find out. I promise.
Exactly. And like we said about like, and when you talk about nutrition, it's not always like, oh, you need to be on a diet. Like, you can still eat what you want, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But there are things that we physically need as a human being, where like we have to have vegetables once in a while.
Yeah.
We need that.
We need the nutrients.
We have to have actual nutrients, and
yes.
Vegetables, protein, very important. So carbohydrates are very important too.
Yes. I mean, carbohydrates make our brain function.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you. Oh my gosh. I know. I mean, people hear this shit from me and they're like, yeah, but she's not a nutrition coach. Yeah, she's not a nutritionist. Yeah, she's not a psychologist.
Yes.
Yeah, she's not a psychiatrist. I'm like, sometimes there's credentials behind my name, but they're not in this field. And so sometimes I like having experts on, such as yourself, to discuss the fact that there are different mediums of healing, and there are whole body approaches.
A lot of people just think they call it bullshit because they don't understand it, or I should say neglect, in a sense. They don't want to understand it, because if they understand it, it's going to change their way of life. Yes. And they don't want that change.
Because wherever you are at in life is okay to be.
If it's working for you, it's working for you. But you got to really think about, like, is it affecting your health and your happiness?
Yes.
And that's the other thing.
Let's be clear, you can do better.
Yeah,
you can be better, and you can want better for yourself. And if this is the motivation for you to get out or get help, then by all means, please.
Yeah.
And don't beat yourself up for where you're at in life.
Exactly. And not only that, people also get the idea where, like, oh, if there needs to be a change, that means I have to make drastic changes. You don't actually need to make drastic changes. If, let's say, you're in a domestic violent relationship, let's go to say, like, oh, you really love this person. It's not that you can't both or individually go see a therapist and work on some things together and change. I've seen that happen. I've seen people who were violent with each other and become not violent, and it's because they got the help they needed. There was unsolved issues in their past, or there was other issues. Like, most of the time, if there's domestic violence and they're a narcissist, there's usually alcohol or drugs involved.
Yes.
Majority of the time.
Yes. They usually go hand in hand. Not always, but usually go hand in hand. Yes. I know, this is a rabbit hole. We could spend an entire episode on this one.
Yeah.
Can you tell the listeners a little bit about what some common symptoms of borderline personality disorder looks like in general, to be on the lookout for, not only in others, but also in themselves?
The main key things, I think there's like 10 of them. So unstable emotions. So if they're intense, rapid shifting emotions that are difficult to regulate, right?
Yes.
Now, it doesn't mean you're acting on them either. You can have distorted perceptions, distorted sense of self and or others, leading to difficulties in relationships. It's not always the case that you're going to have difficulties in relationships, but usually the distorted sense of self and others is very, very much a key factor.
Okay. What does that look like, distorted sense of self?
So, have you ever heard somebody say, like, if you're in public and you're talking to somebody, you're a chameleon?
Yes.
Because you can adapt so well.
Yes.
So with BPD, you can adapt, and there's nothing wrong with adapting, but you can adapt so much that you lose sense of who you truly are.
Ah, okay.
So you tend to not recognize who you are anymore, or you end up liking something because somebody else likes it, but you as a person may be like, I may like it, but it's not me.
Right.
Right? So that's the distortion there.
Yeah. I think I spent a lot of my time in my 20s. I was almost diagnosed with borderline when I walked into my therapist's office. My good therapist, who I now see and love, and yes, I did experience others. but I was 4 out of 5 diagnosable symptoms. And so I spent a lot of my 20s with a lot of BPD symptoms and a lot of being a chameleon and just being what other people wanted me to be, because that's what I thought I should do.
Exactly. Now, not saying there is a healthy way of being a chameleon where, in a sense, that you are more understanding and flexible in conversation and being more respectful of others, regardless of what their views and the way they are.
Right.
Without losing your sense of self.
Right. Yes. You can be and it can be, I think, tricky or a fine line for some people to walk, is being yourself authentically and showing up and knowing who you are while still being respectful to somebody else and their opinions and their ideas and what they value and what they love, even if it doesn't align with all of that about you.
Yep. Fear of abandonment is another one. So
yeah, I've got that.
A fear of being alone or abandoned that can lead to maladaptive behaviors.
Can you describe what maladaptive behaviors are?
It's the best way to describe it is chameleon, like, again.
Okay.
You are
blending in.
You're blending in. You're conforming to somebody else and what their desires are. And you're not listening to what your desires and needs are anymore. So
that's maladaptive behaviors.
Pretty much.
Gotcha.
You got impulsive behaviors. So risky behaviors like substance misuse, gambling, binge eating, or unsafe sex.
Can we just be clear for the listeners that these are not all together? You don't have to have all of these.
Correct. You
to
do
be
not.
borderline. Yes.
Nope.
Okay. Because I know with my mother, who I've talked about in other episodes, being UBPD, meaning undiagnosed borderline personality disorder, there are some of the bigger symptoms of BPD that she just does not have. Like, doesn't have the impulsivity, especially on a surface level, if you know her. But if you know her well, she has like a history of that as a child. Like, and it's something you would have to know somebody's intimate details and history to know, oh, well, she actually does or did have that. Like,
exactly.
She would impulsively, like, she would brush her teeth with baking soda and then eat the box of baking soda because she couldn't stop herself, or the toothpaste, and she would eat the toothpaste, and it just, and she would describe this to me, when I was an adult or teenager, and I'd be like, what? I don't get it. Like, why would you eat that?
And that's why you most of the time when you have those impulsivities, you are diagnosed with OCD.
Yes.
So for me personally, I have OCD, but believe it or not, I didn't even realize this until I went to therapy, is my OCD is self-mutilation.
Yeah.
Because I had such a bad nail biting habit, and I would do it and do it and do it. And even when I knew it was too short, I would keep going.
Yeah.
And like my fingers would hurt, or I'd bite my cuticles, and I would do it to lay blood. But I subconsciously was enjoying the pain. It made me feel kind of alive.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So
in that book that I referenced earlier, in the What Happened to You, they talk about like why children and adults, cut themselves or hurt themselves. And it's I can't remember the science behind it, and so I'll have to reread that before I quote it. But it was very specific as to why people do this.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, this is so. I use this big fancy word earlier, elucidating. It's so helpful. Like I'm like, oh, now I understand. Like, I raised my ex's kids, which I mentioned in another episode, and the oldest used to cut herself and self-harm in other ways and rip out all of her eyebrows and rip out all of her eyelashes. And I'm like, doesn't that hurt? But no, they wouldn't necessarily feel pain. You would feel alive. You would feel, and I can't, it's bugging me that I can't remember the psychology behind this.
Yeah, so it is a sense of feeling like it's a way to keep yourself present.
Yes.
For the nail biting, like I would do it and not realize I was doing it. It was a form of disassociation.
Yes.
When I was doing it. I could be working on something and be doing it. So like part of my like subconscious is like, all right, we're disassociated a little bit. You're still focusing, but we're hurting yourself, so you can kind of still feel present.
Right.
It's a whole topic which we could definitely go into in the part 2.
Yeah, I would like to get into that, especially because it is prevalent, and it's prevalent especially with young people. Any age. There's a lot of self-harm happening, and I think people don't necessarily understand why kids and adults do that. And
it's your subconscious screaming.
Yes.
It is a subconscious way of like, I'm screaming for help. Yeah. I'm in pain. Mentally, you could, like, your brain could not be registering it but your body does. Your
Right.
subconscious does. So you're doing it to be like, hey, something's wrong, something's wrong, something's wrong.
Yes. Well, I do remember there was one part of it that Dr. Bruce Perry talked about how oftentimes people will self-mutilate, like cut themselves. They won't feel pain. They'll just start to feel normal as they do that.
Exactly.
And I'm like, oh.
Because most of the time, the reason why is they grew up with so much pain in their life that's what they consider normal. So when you don't have that, it's not normal to you.
Right. And so baseline, they're getting to baseline. They're just getting to normal by slicing their arm or whatever.
I never went that far in the cutting, but mine was more of my fingers. But I also have OCD for more like organizational, like, and it's a control factor.
Yeah.
I have a need to control, and luckily I don't have it as badly. I shouldn't say don't have it. I still have it, but I navigate it a lot better, so I don't feel as aggressive about it.
Yes.
Impulsive behaviors is very different than the self-harm impulsive behaviors. So other than self-harm, there's also suicidal thoughts, recurring thoughts of suicide or threats. For example, I have had an attempt, right? A disassociated attempt. Right. I've thought of things, but I've never planned it.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a difference between planning and ideation, and the ideation can include plans, but it doesn't have to.
Yeah. Ideation can have, like, a plan. Like, in that moment, you could be like, oh, this is how I'm going to do it.
Right.
But you're not planning it. You don't have a time. You don't have a date. You don't have a when.
You're not like, oh, I'm not picking this bridge on this day when traffic is minimal and blah, 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 whatever.
And you're not navigating or wrecking your brain about it where you want to know when you're going to do it, right?
Right.
That is the difference on that note. And then you can also, the threat part is you're threatening to do it. So you're telling somebody, like, I'm going to do this.
Right.
And what a lot of people don't realize is a lot of people do it as a form of manipulation, but it's also their way of, like, screaming for help.
Yes. It's often a cry for help.
Yeah. Most of the time, yeah. And sometimes people know it's manipulation and they use it for that purpose as well.
Yep.
But there's also black and white thinking, viewing things in extremes like all good or all bad. There's no in between.
Yes. Oh, and so many people are guilty of this, myself included. I was terrible about being a black and white thinker before I did a lot of shit ton of work on myself.
It's hard to look in the gray.
It is. Because black and white is so much easier and more comfortable and makes the brain happier.
Yep. Volatile relationships. So intense and unstable relationships with family, friends, and loved ones. That includes, they can be super hot and intense and not healthy. Not saying you can't have a hot and intense relationship or friendship or whatever type of relationship you have with somebody.
Right.
And it be healthy, like where you dive all in. You can have that. But this is more of unhealthy. You're diving all in and they're unhealthy and it's harmful to you.
Right.
And so they tend to be short-term relationships that you have in your life.
Gotcha.
And then the last one was the disassociation, feelings of being cut off from oneself, observing oneself from outside one's body, or feelings of unreality. Like, so we've delved into that a little bit, but those are the most common, like, key factors that make up BPD, along with having other diagnoses, as you can see, like the suicidal, that's part of depression.
Right. Yeah.
If you have suicidal ideation, you have depression.
Yep.
Majority of the time.
Yep.
So
they hardly ever, you hardly ever don't have depression when you're actively have suicidal ideation.
Yeah.
I'm sure it could happen. I haven't personally seen an exam, but I'm sure it could happen. I normally do the 10 question quick quiz round at the end, but since we're going to make this a 2-part series, I'm going to break that in half.
Okay.
And do the first 5, and then we'll do the last 5 next part episode, which our listeners can look forward to part 2.
All right.
So the first one is, what piece of art, movie, show, or any creative work really was incredibly influential for you, and why?
I do love reading, and I really enjoy that. That is my personal escape. And oddly enough, I really enjoy urban romance.
Yeah.
So I'm a multi hobbyist. So I like painting. I like drawing.
Yes.
I make jewelry. I write. I love building things with my hands.
Yes.
Very much hands-on, very artistic. So when you ask me like what piece of art, movie, or show, most of the time I like doing them myself.
I love it.
And it's actually my mode of self-care and therapy.
I love that. Oh my God, this may be one of the best answers to this question ever.
When you do a hobby that you enjoy and you can kind of like be in a flotation mode while doing it.
And like in the zone or whatever you want to call it.
You're meditating.
Yes.
You're meditating. And
you're present.
A lot of people don't realize that you're actually meditating when you're doing that. When you zone out into something you enjoy.
Yep.
And so
because you're fully present in that moment.
Yes, exactly. So when people are like, "Oh, I have a hard time meditating,"
you're
and
like,
sitting there, well, most of the time when you meditate, when I say that is you're sitting there, you're being present with yourself in that moment, not doing anything.
Right.
A lot of people have a hard time with that. So instead I tell them, I was like, "What kind of hobbies do you like?
Yeah.
What do you like to do for fun?"
Yeah.
You're meditating when you do that.
Yes.
I always try to encourage more artistic things when people do hobbies, because you can have a hobby, like, for example, I'm a nerd, 100%. Like, I love playing Magic. Yes. I play Magic the Gathering, and it takes so much brain power, though.
Does it?
So,
I've never actually played it. I've wanted to get into it.
It takes a lot of brain power. So you can enjoy that, and that can be a hobby. And you can kind of meditate into it, but the thing is your brain is working so hard when you're playing a game like that. When you do artistic things, it can be fun, creative, and new, and you're doing things with your hands and you're zoning into it, but you're not having to crank and really work your brain like, what do I do next? 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 Right? So do something, a hobby that is more meditative, calming to you. Gardening's a good one.
Yep. Some people use cleaning. Like, it just depends on what works for you. I use
cleaning at times too, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
I wish I used cleaning. What do you do to decompress?
This might seem silly, but my decompression is quiet time.
Why is that? That's not silly. Not at all.
So my quiet time for me is I will disconnect from talking to people, and I will usually be reading. So I get night terrors. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes I struggle with sleep, or I get so exhausted mentally and emotionally, and even though I want to take a nap during the day, which naps are great, first and foremost, listen to what your body wants.
Yes.
I will sleep if I know that I'm so exhausted from all the activities I've done. I'm just like mentally, emotionally, or socially, especially if my social battery is depleted, socially exhausted, I will go to sleep.
Yeah.
So for me, it's that, or I do self-care routines where I am like pampering my own body.
Good.
Like, I need to, even basic things, shave my legs, or do a full grooming routine, let's do a face mask today.
Yeah, where you feel like you're really taking care of yourself, physically taking care of your body.
That I would say is probably the most decompressing thing I can do.
I love that. It's excellent. And it's just an added bonus that you have a self-care routine that goes into it.
Well, and when you take care of yourself, especially if you do like spa things like that, you're making yourself feel very physically good, mentally good, because you're playing off of a confidence booster.
Yes.
Right? So, and that releases endorphins into your body.
Right.
Especially your brain. So.
Yes. I love it. What is the last self-improvement or trauma book or show you read and or saw and highly recommend?
So instead of like reading a book, I'll do activities.
Okay.
Like little worksheet activities or podcasts. I do have a few that I listen to.
What movie or book are you currently recommending to anybody who will listen?
I have quite a few favorite movies. Don't get me wrong. I'm pretty sure everybody does, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of the way it moved me and made me think about things in such a strong sense of how it affects society, I would have to say The Help.
Oh, that's such a good movie. And good book, too.
Yes.
If you haven't read it, it's also a great book.
Yeah.
But the movie was so well done.
It was so well done. And it has so many strong morals for one's character.
Yes.
I don't know if there are a lot of people who've actually broken down the movie and or the book and been like, can't you see, like, this is a growth for this person?
I mean, probably. I haven't looked it up online, but there's probably all kinds of forums that chat about it.
I mean, Minnie baked a pie of her shit, right?
And it tasted good.
Right?
Apparently.
How much sugar did she put in that thing, right?
A fuck ton, I'm sure.
But that's my point. Like, she had her own personal growths. There were so many personal growths. And then you have Skeeter, who's making all of these columns that she wants to publish, right?
Right.
And she's doing so for her own personal growth, too.
Yep.
But she is the catalyst of it all.
Yeah, and she's growing along the way. She
Exactly.
didn't realize that this was not going to be just, a few articles. Like, this is her growing and learning.
There's a lot of psychological aspects to the movie, and I think it's really important. I would have to say even the movie Split, like, having split personalities like that, it is like that for people.
I will have to watch that. I don't think that's one I've seen.
It is a horror movie.
I like horror movies.
Thriller, probably more so.
I mean, my favorite movie is it's a psychological thriller, and it's disturbing to plenty of people who would not be interested in watching that at all, but it's The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Raimi and I talk about it in the episode with Raimi, which is episode 5. I digress.
So...
Squirrel.
So, I would say the top 2 movies I would recommend that really psychologically moved me, and I noticed a lot on, would be The Help, and it's called Victoria and Abdul.
Victoria and Abdul? Mm-hmm. Okay, I've definitely not seen that one.
It's about Queen Victoria, who brings in an advisor from India.
Oh, how fun.
And creates this friendship. And it is very platonic friendship that they have, but her court did not like how close they were.
Oh. I can't wait to do part 2 with you, and I hope the listeners are looking forward to this as well. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll get to the second half of those questions in part 2.
Sounds fun.
Thank you.
Can't wait.
I hope you all enjoyed having Anna here as much as I enjoyed having her on the show. If you think it's worth it, please rate the podcast 5 stars on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get your podcasts, because it helps me grow and it helps me expand the podcast and be able to bring you more exciting guests, new guests, and different topics and opportunities for conversation, and write to me about the topics that you want to hear about. This is a podcast about trauma and travel and everything in between, so that leaves a lot of room. Send me your message requests for what kind of topics you want. What questions can I answer for you? I try to get to them as often as I can. As always, work your shit out, not on other people, and we'll see you next time.